afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Because some of you have gotten here very early, and all of you appear to be here now. We're going to start right now instead of in 5 minutes. Anyway, I'm pleased and proud that the Schemmel Forum has been able to prevent this three-part dialogue on Israel-Palestinian conflict. It is a rare privilege that we have to hear both sides of this unfortunate saga in parallel presentations by two scholars giving their respective views of the situation. This process that David and Hussein have created gives, I believe, a truer picture of the difficulties of the conflict than we get from the fervent champions of one side or the other. As they speak today, and as they have spoken in the past, there is reflected in the format a search for common ground. And what else can we hope for at this moment in this of so many years but a search for common ground? It's no secret to anyone in this room that one of these scholars is Maurice and my son. Yeah? A professor of Jewish history and former chair of the history department at UCLA, David is on leave from his institution to assume the presidency of the Center for Jewish History in New York City. Earlier this year, in February, in fact, UCLA is always with him. So in February, at UCLA, he opened a Center for History and Policy, an important program designed to foster partnerships between historians and the leaders of educational and cultural institutions, museums, libraries, centers for group programming, and of course, politics. And so he personally has gone from an academically based center to one that houses 5 different purveyors of programs related to Jewish history and culture. Hussein Ibish, born in Lebanon, was educated in the US. He has a bachelor's degree from Emerson College and a Ph.D. in comparative literature from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He's been affiliated with a number of institutions and is presently a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. Hussein describes himself as an agnostic from Muslim American community. And if he doesn't mind, I would describe him as a public intellectual who is an active advocate for Arab causes in the United States. Together in this conversation with David, they give us an example of the civility and mutual respect that are often lacking in such discussions. So please welcome them both.
I'll start, right? Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Mother, for that wonderful introduction. It's really a pleasure to be back here amongst so many old friends. And today in particular, which happens to be the 11th anniversary of the passing of my beloved grandmother, Mea Skelb, whom many of you knew, great matriarch of the community, lover of her people, and lover of people. And I think therein lay one of the great features, one of the great characteristics of Mea Gelb. She loved her people, and she loved people in general. And she loved Jews and she loved Arabs. She loved Christians and Muslims and Jews. She was, in that sense, very Catholic in her love of others. And I think it's particularly fitting that we bring to a conclusion this third in a series of presentations on the Israel-Palestine conflict on this day with Mea Skelb very much in our minds. I should say that she was the recipient of an honorary doctorate from this institution, as was her husband, Morris B. Gelb, as was her daughter, Sandra Myers, as was her son-in-law, Maury Myers. I frankly don't know what they're waiting for, really, at this point. But I'll have to labor a little bit more, I guess. And it's also a delight to be here with my friend Hussein, who from the first time that we began this work together in the fall of 2015, we recognized that this was more than just delivering a series of lectures. This was really an important political and moral mission to demonstrate a very basic proposition, which is that both Israelis and Palestinians not only have their own narratives, but those narratives contain within them a great deal of truth. And in fact, embedded in those truths are also rights. And we are trying to unpack this conundrum where there are two instances of peoples which possess rights that don't always sit comfortably with one another. And how do we make sense of that, and what do we do? Our attitude is to approach each of these stories, each of these narratives, which contain a good deal of truth in them, and in which are embedded rights, with a mix of critical distance and empathy. We believe that striking that balance between critical distance and empathy is an important path towards deeper understanding and toward an ability to recognize the humanity of the other. We can't do that in completely uncritical fashion, and we surely can't do it without empathy. So that has been our method as we've gone about this work from the West Coast to the East Coast. And if any of you are in New York City tomorrow night, please join us at Fordham University, where we will be also presenting on this subject at 6 p.m. At Lincoln Center. But we're delighted to be here in Scranton now, and without further ado, I'm going to jump right in and remind us where we are. So in the first lecture here at the University of Scranton, we discussed the first phase of the conflict between these two parties. And we designate that the conflict between Jews and Arabs over the land known as Palestine, State of Israel, EgyptIsrael. There are many different names that have been ascribed to it, but very much focused in that first presentation we were on Arabs and Jews. In the second presentation, which dealt with the period from 1948 to 1967 through when we hinted at the end of developments over the subsequent decade from 67 to 78, 79, we dealt with the conflict between Israel, the newly created State of Israel, created on the 14th of May, 1948, the 70th anniversary of which is upcoming, and the Arab states, the conflict between the newly created State of Israel and Arab states. Many of them themselves were newly created in the wake of the destruction of the major empires of Europe and the Middle East following the First World War. Today, what we want to turn our attention to is the third phase in the conflict, which commences with the ending of the second phase, which is the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis from 1978, 79 to the present. And one of the things that haunts us, as if that conflict weren't nettlesome enough, is whether we're on the brink of a fourth phase in the conflict, a religious conflict between Muslims and Jews, which we fear may be even more dangerous than all the three periods of conflict before. So let's just take a brief step back and look at where we ended last time. We ended in 1967, the year in which Israel won a lightning and devastating war, at least for the Arab side. On the Israeli side, it was perceived quite differently, in the course of which, during the Six-Day or 1967 War of June 1967, Israel acquired through conquest significant new territories in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Desert, and the Golan Heights. This military victory, lightning strike and victory in 6 days, inspired in Israelis, and for that matter Jews the world over, a deep sense of ethnic pride, in no small part because there were very grave fears on the eve of the 67 war, in May 1967, that the Arab world would at long last succeed in its mission of driving the Jews into the sea. That, in fact, this fragile Jewish presence in the land of Israel would be undone after a mere 20 years. And that moment of ethnic pride attached to Israel's military victory also unleashed a very powerful sense of messianic expectation, as if God had intervened in history in order to save the Jews from the brink of destruction. That messianic energy is not a mere abstraction. It, in fact, has served as a very powerful animating force for the religious Zionist settlers movement that in the early 70s began to settle on the newly acquired land, which it regarded as part of God's divine intention, indeed as connected to biblical Israel, and as a harbinger of the coming of an actual messianic figure. And so from the Israeli perspective, we have soaring ethnic pride punctuated by a very keen sense of messianic expectation. Meanwhile, on the Arab side.
Yeah, a very different experience on the Arab side. I mean, first of all, for the Palestinians, it's another round of expulsion and exile. It's often forgotten because people tend to concentrate on the 700,000 or 800,000 Palestinians that were displaced in 1947 and 48. But in 1967, another approximately 300,000 found themselves displaced. That's a very significant figure. And it reinscribes the experience of dispossession, exile, and what have you as a sort of defining feature of the Palestinian experience. As I've said before, the main thing that distinguishes Palestinians from other Levantine Arabs, from other Arabs who speak a similar kind of Arabic and eat similar foods and whatnot in Syria and Lebanon and parts of Jordan, is that historical experience of the 1948 to 1967 expulsions, and then now 50 years of occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, which are unique to them. And that really, I think, has those experiences mean that there is a distinct Palestinian identity based on a shared history, which otherwise it didn't exist before and otherwise might not have, but it does. Can you go back a bit? Sorry. For the Arab states, the change is profound. And I think it's very hard to convey this, but I'm going to try. The trauma of this defeat, first of all, because it was unexpected, and secondly, because it was so swift and so total, right? 6 days, complete victory on every front, and massive amount of territory lost, is a historical trauma from which the Arab world, much of it, still hasn't recovered. First of all, it was as this bullet point down there suggests, it was the beginning of the end of secular Arab nationalism. And it took quite a while for that secular Arab nationalism to really die and to be overwhelmed, to be overtaken by Islamism of various kinds, all from the Muslim Brotherhood kind all the way to the Al-Qaeda kind, as a kind of revolutionary and kind of guiding ethos for many people, especially for angry people in the Arab world. It's not hegemonic, but it is the defining kind of political ideology among those who are politicized. And the reason for this is they're the same thing. The depth of the trauma came from the depths of self-deception. Almost everyone in the Arab world went into this, with some rare exceptions, went into this feeling either that victory was assured or that at a minimum there would be a very long, painful, drawn-out battle at the end of which the Israelis would be forced to come to terms in some reasonable way. Almost no one anticipated a quick and thorough defeat. And in fact, for a lot of people, it was the world turned upside down. Right? It's not, in other words, it's not just that you've misunderstood reality. Reality is the opposite of what you thought it was at its most fundamental level. So this kind of mind-bending encounter with reality was very, very difficult for people to put up with. And the final thing I want to say is that in large parts of the Arab world, I think there's the trauma has changed personality, has changed collective personality. Before 1967, the basic Arab attitude towards the world was optimistic, was engaged, was forward-looking, was driving, was basically, was relatively healthy. After 1967, and you see it to this day, there is an inwardness and a sense of that defeat is inevitable. And you have to go to these little Gulf countries like the UAE and Qatar, which were not independent and didn't participate in this, to find Arabs who collectively don't seem to have any sense that whatever they do is almost guaranteed to fail. That all comes out of this.
That sense of fatalism of which you speak was born of historical experience. We remember what Hussein just mentioned was the crushing defeat of 67.
Yeah.
But of course, there was shock and surprise at the United Nations resolution calling for the partition of Palestine in 1947, and then the defeat of Palestinian and Arab forces in the subsequent war. And even before that, now we have the depth of perspective to see in our third session together in 1917, when the British tipped their hand in favor of the Jewish side in the Balfour Declaration. That was also an occasion of surprise and shock on the local Arab side in Palestine. And that has been a recurrent motif in the history of the Palestinian Arab population.
That's right. But this is qualitatively different, and it's unique in the sense that there was always a ready narrative for what was going wrong and why. In 1917, it's British imperialism. With the partition resolution, it's the world feeling guilty about the Holocaust. In 1948, the idea was that, the Arabs are disunited and they've betrayed us and they never really cared and they didn't put as many people into the field as the Jewish forces did, which was true, and they didn't really care because they were the wrong kinds of government. And in 67, people believed you had strong, independent, national, proud Arab armies that could and would do the job. And that's what was shattered. There was no narrative available other than collective failure of the most radical kind, right?
Right, and particularly the shaming of the most gloried and storied figure of Arab nationalism of the day,
Nasser.
Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser.
Exactly.
I think we probably have to push on to 73.
We do.
I'm going to have you start.
Right. So in 1973 was a sort of a partial recuperation to some extent of the Arab sense of dignity, at least a little bit. It was a war that, from the Arab point of view, was aimed mainly not at reversing 1948, which after 1967 really becomes unattainable, but at regaining the territories that were lost in 1967. That's how most people looked at it, frankly, if they were to be honest. And the war went fairly well at the beginning. But when Israel regained its balance and was supported by the United States, there was a shift, and the Arab side mainly lost, although with some limited gains in the Suez area and some other things. But the point is that at the end of the day, Arabs came out of this believing that they were not, with a small bit of dignity restored, that they had done much better this time. And secondly, you've got two things that are put in the works here. First, I think it becomes possible for Anwar Sadat to pursue peace with Israel on the grounds that he can say to the Egyptians, look, obviously we're not going to recover our territory lost in 67 without a negotiation with Israel, so let's do that. And in fact, that happened. And the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt has withstood every possible test so far, including a period of Muslim Brotherhood rule in Egypt, not only undestroyed, but undented even. The other thing is the two-state solution becomes all the more sort of obviously necessary. It gets set in motion in 67 because, as I say, the results of the 48 war really sort of got consolidated. But I think after 1973, it became obvious to the Palestinians that the bookend of their ambitions would be an independent state in the occupied territories. And then the next sort of 10 years were spent by Palestinians sort of convincing themselves and each other that this would be an okay thing.
So if the 1973 war marked a restoration of a measure of dignity to the Arab side, and indeed it very much was perceived that way, and in many settings in the Arab world was perceived as a victory.
Yeah, at least
on the
moral.
Israeli side, it was perceived as a crushing and shocking failure. First of all, the war broke out on Yom Kippur, 1973, a day of solemn, prayerful, ritual observance by much of the Jewish population of the country, came as a shock. And not only did it come as a shock because it was on Yom Kippur, it came as a shock because intelligence reports had been predicting an attack by Egyptian forces for months. And those reports were ignored, which led to what is often perceived to be the greatest intelligence failure in Israeli military history, prompting the creation of a commission of inquiry, the Agranov Commission, that indeed determined that there were serious lapses in intelligence. So we have, again, in a certain sense, these parallel narratives, but they move in opposite directions. Right? 67 marks elation on the Israeli side and devastation on the Arab side. And here, moving in parallel, the vectors operate in the opposite direction.
Also, which side got surprised? Because the Arab world was, there was a lot of saber rattling, but they were not ready for the attack in 67, and they woke up to find the Air Forces.
Ironically enough, for all of Nasser's saber rattling and closing of the Straits of Tiran and removal of United Nations emergency forces from Sinai, the attack came as a surprise. So the element of surprise was present in both cases. What the 73 war does, in addition to take a significant chunk out of the Israeli sense of invulnerability, invincibility, is induce a new measure of realism into its strategic thinking. 67 had led Israel to believe that it was the unsurpassed power of the neighborhood. 73 diminishes somewhat that sense of invincibility.
I think it's also, it must be said, it really should be said, that the other thing that happened in 73 is the ascendancy of the United States as a diplomatic power. The Soviet Union went into complete eclipse because the way the war was handled, especially by Kissinger, the United States emerged as the broker on good terms with everybody, and the one power that was sort of going to hold the balance in its hands. The Soviet Union receded. Sadat already wanted to switch sides from the Russian side to the American side. He went right ahead with that shortly after the war. And it set in motion, or it announced, I guess 73 arranged for and announced a period of American dominance of Middle Eastern politics in general at the international level, and this issue in particular that may be going away now for the first time since then.
Right.
It probably is going away.
We remember that world, right? That strategic equipoise when the world was divided in the Cold War between spheres of influence.
Exactly.
73 marks a moment at which there's going to be a recalibration of that sphere of influence, and one very key indication is that Egypt is now tipping its hand in favor of the Americans. That has significant consequences for bilateral relations as well as for regional affairs, and lays the groundwork for
the peace process.
This.
And the whole peace process.
Many of us remember that moment in 1977, the fall of 1977, when the Egyptian president, no longer Nasser, but Anwar Sadat, alighted from a plane at Ben Gurion Airport and went to the Knesset, Israeli parliament, to deliver a message of peace. A striking transformation of the preceding 30 years of rhetoric that had existed between the two sides, and a bold act of peace, which actually, Sadat tells us, he had begun to think of some 6 years earlier. And certainly after 1973, when the Egyptians gained a measure of dignity that had been so significantly taken away from them in 67. thereby enabling his bold political move.
Right.
Ironically, or perhaps not, he found as a partner a person who would seem on the face of it the unlikeliest partner for peace. The longtime leader of the opposition party in Israel, the Cherut party, which is today's Likud party, Menachem Begin. For 30 years, Menachem Begin dwelt in opposition in the Knesset. Very often as a kind of saber-rattling foil to the dominant figure of Israeli political life in those first 3 decades, David Ben-Gurion. In 1977, after 30 years in the political wilderness, Menachem Begin and his party were elected to government in what is known in Hebrew as the Mahapach, the overturning. So significant was that development. Begin was cast as a hard right nationalist who drew his greatest strength not from the traditional European or Ashkenazi political establishment, but from the disenfranchised Mizrahi or Middle Eastern underclass. He had built up a reputation as someone who believed that in every generation there was an Amalek, there was an enemy of the Jewish people whose intention was to extirpate it, to destroy it. And thus it would seem that any initiative or foray by an Arab leader would be dismissed out of hand. In fact, Begin underwent his own, as we tend to call it, Nixon in China moment, in which, in retrospect, it would seem that it was only someone coming from that political perspective who actually could have delivered a vote in the Knesset in favor of a peace negotiation and peace treaty with Egypt. In fact, you needed someone of that political perspective. To be sure, the rendering of Begin that I've just offered is one-dimensional, and he was a much more complicated figure than that. He was also the heir of the great revisionist Zionist leader Vladimir Zev Jabotinsky, who at some level was a liberal Democrat. And Begin also was the heir of that tradition, and thus understood the opportunity at hand.
Yeah, so on the, I think for the Arab side, what's crucial here is this is the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict. We still talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict, but really that only properly describes the period between 1947-48 with the first war until this peace treaty is signed. After this peace treaty is signed, Egypt has withdrawn from the conflict, and that means conventional wars between the Arab states and Israel are no longer on the table. They are no longer practically possible or considered desirable or an option, so that the conflict then reverts to something much closer to the way it was in the 1930s to the mid-40s, and enters into this new phase, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict,
right,
over land and power in the occupied territories. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, we just have to introduce one additional character to the story. Yeah. Anwar Sadat, Egyptian army officer, successor to Nasser, recognizes that in all likelihood Egypt will never defeat Israel in a military conflict, acts on that piece of realpolitik and makes this bold gesture. Menachem Begin, far-right leader, defies his skeptics and reaches out his hand to Nasser. The third unlikely character in this story is United States President Jimmy Carter, the earnest evangelical Christian who would seem to miss the nuances of realpolitik as played out in the Middle East, but then nonetheless was at the right moment in terms of that realignment of the map of the Middle East and the world, for that matter, between Soviet and American forces. Seized upon the day, summoned Begin and Sadat to Camp David in 1978. What ensued was a year of negotiations that culminated in 1979 with the signing of a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, as Hussein just said, bringing to an end 30 years of state-declared war between those two countries, and inaugurating a new era of relative peace between Jewish and Arab states. But at the same time, reintroducing the Palestinians onto the stage of history.
And it's very important because this agreement between Israel and Egypt basically is a withdrawal from all the territories occupied in 1967, the Egyptian territories, I mean, to the inch. In return
Sinai
for,
Desert.
Sinai and some other things, but mainly it's Sinai, yeah. In return for normalization of relations and a kind of cold peace or cold kind of friendship, but still cooperation, and it's been upheld by both sides. Now, this not only transforms the struggle from an Arab-Israeli to a Palestinian-Israeli conflict, so it's very, very different, and that's still the phase that we're in, given our model that we started with. But also, it's a template, right, for peace between Arabs and Israel. And the Jordanians, when they came to sign their peace treaty, they had exactly the same deal. They got all their territory back in exchange for a full recognition. Now, this is significant because that's the deal the Palestinians expected to get, with some modifications. They thought, right, that's how Arabs do peace with Israel. The Israelis withdraw from areas conquered in 1967, and then we make peace with Israel. That's the deal. It's there in 242, UN Resolution 242. It's there in 338. And it's not just theoretical. The Egyptians got it. The Jordanians got it. We'll get it. And we'll all move forward, except not. Because I think, though the Palestinians saw a perfect analogy, and the Israelis did not. And this has led to a great deal of confusion and frustration. Right. There's one other thing I'd like to mention, but we can come to it in a sec.
Yeah, no, I just want to say that embedded in the agreement between Egypt and Israel was a series of clauses dealing with the Palestinians.
Yeah, I don't.
In which there was a call for progress towards granting Palestinians, the language used was autonomy.
Yeah.
Now, an interesting question is, can or should Sadat have pushed for more for the Palestinians, rather than this local form of autonomy that was rather restricted in form?
But it's very important that this is in an annex. It's not in the actual treaty itself. It's in an annex, and that tells you everything you need to know. It is a pro forma gesture. The Egyptians did not expect that they would be decisive in whether this happened or not. They felt the need to put it in. The Israelis did not mind putting the aspirational stuff in. It was very vague, and it is an annex. So that tells you everything you need to know. One more thing. Now, I just want to talk about another important aspect of this, but if you have something...
No.
Okay. It's very important to note. No, this is significant. Sadat had to do a lot of things to sell this in Egypt, right? Egyptians are very nationalistic. Ultimately, to get their territory back, they were willing to do it. But it was very shocking. People were not psychologically and politically prepared for it. And in the end, he was killed. In the same way Yitzhak Rabin was killed by fanatics on both sides. To make deals is very dangerous in these things. One of the things he did was to tack to the religious right and portray himself in contrast to Nasser as a very pious man, the praying president, he called himself, and implying as it was true that Nasser never prayed and laughed at the religious right and made fun of the Muslim Brotherhood and imprisoned them. He let the Brotherhood out of jail. He unleashed the Islamists. It was one of the series of things that happened in 1978, 79, and 80 that has given us the present-day Islamist movement. And I can't go into the details of how it worked here, but it was a crucial moment in unleashing or preparing the groundwork for the kind of problem of violent Muslim radicals that we have today all over the Middle East. And that this is connected to that.
Right. Begin, meanwhile, had to tend to his right wing with respect to agreeing to a treaty with Israel's largest and most powerful Arab neighbor. But he largely succeeded in persuading, with a few notable exceptions, his colleagues in the Herut party and further right, that this was the prudent. This was a prudent risk to take at this point in time. More generally, I would say, there was once again a sense of great optimism in Israel in the immediate aftermath of the treaty, that at long last, peace, long sought after peace, with the Arab world was around the corner. And you can sort of get a sense of a kind of seesaw of sentiments from 1967, elation in 1967, devastation in 1973. elation once again, or at least a sense of new optimism after the peace treaty with Egypt, and then a sense of plummeting national morale 3 years later.
It's probably worth me saying that in spite of everything, and I'm sure they exist, I haven't ever actually met an Egyptian who thinks that was a bad thing to have done. They must exist, but I haven't met them.
Right. So in the early 1980s, as a kind of a coda to a decade of very active political activity by the Palestine Liberation Organization in the 1970s, and as a kind of lingering recollection of that, Israel, or at least some of its leaders, remember how, or call to mind how tantalizing the prospect would be to eliminate the PLO as a threat to Israel. And this is very much in the mind of Israel's defense minister in the early 1980s, under Menachem Begin, a man by the name of Ariel Sharon, a famous Israeli army general and political figure, who, following the attempted assassination by Palestinian forces on the Israeli ambassador in London, declares the need to create what he called a cordon sanitaire, a kind of safe zone, 25 miles up from the northern border of Israel into Lebanon, to make it safe of any terrorist activity whatsoever. This is what Sharon announces in the wake of the attempted assassination, and Israeli forces move into Lebanon in order to create that cordon sanitaire. It turns out that Sharon actually had a broader ambition, which was to make his way to Beirut and root out of Beirut the presence of the Palestine Liberation Organization and its leader Yasser Arafat. It's not at all clear that he revealed his cards to his boss, Menachem Begin, who apparently did not know that that was Sharon's real intent. And what began to unfold was the Israeli equivalent of the Vietnam War.
Before you go on, let me just throw in, I'll tell you who wasn't surprised. All of us teenagers in Beirut. Because I was 16, I was 15, 16 when all this happened, when the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel happened. I was a kid, and we all said to each other, now they're going to come for us. How long will it be before the Israeli army comes to Beirut? Wasn't long.
Interesting.
And we weren't stupid.
Yes. What interesting, because those who were surprised were many, many Israelis who believed, in fact, that the intent of Operation Peace for Galilee, as the war was first designated, was to create this 25-mile safe zone. And then as more reservists were called up and more troops sent into Lebanon, it became clear that Israel was digging itself deeper into the mud. Israel, by the way, would not withdraw fully from Lebanon for 18 years.
Yeah, 2000.
18 years. So it really, and it had very much the psychological effect of the Vietnam War on the Israeli psyche. In part because it is often said that this operation, which then developed into a full-scale war when Israeli troops made their way to Beirut, was the first war Israel undertook without a national consensus. In fact, there was very fierce division within Israel, and I remember in 1982, when I began graduate studies at Tel Aviv University with the intention of immigrating to Israel and joining the Israel Defense Forces, and recognizing this war underway, that this was not the path that I could choose at that moment. In fact, joined a different army, as I say, the army of peace demonstrators. There were massive peace demonstrations against this war throughout Israel, including one in what is now known as Rabin Square in the center of Tel Aviv, where 400,000 people, 1/10 of the population of Israel then, showed up to express their opposition to this war. So it mobilized a huge constituency of Israelis in opposition to this war.
Yeah. There's a narrative of loss of innocence that you've just sort of explained that's connected to this war, that one of the hardest things I've had to do in making this kind of intellectual journey is understand the validity of that narrative, because it looks so different from the other side. It looks like a joke from the other side that, okay, with all that history, and now this is when you lost your innocence. But that's the way it felt, and that was a genuine experience, and it not, there are reasons for it. There are reasons why we have to struggle to understand it. But there are also reasons why it was such a powerful and enduring narrative.
I can only convey to you the shock and horror, and this I'm speaking very personally, when we heard the news of the Sabra and Shatila massacre, September 16th, 1982. I was in Jerusalem, and we streamed to the house of the Prime Minister on Balfour Street. And there I saw something that I had never seen before in my life, and being the naive Zionist that I was at that time, it simply was beyond credulity. I saw Jews not only yelling at each other, but beating each other up. And I simply couldn't imagine that. That moment was a watershed for me and many others. Under Israeli military oversight, Christian Phalange forces in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps undertook a massacre of Palestinians that we're still not sure to this day how many were killed, anywhere between 750 to 3,000 people.
Something like that.
That range. What happened was, in the wake of that devastating tragedy, the image of Israel in the world, and for that matter, the image of Israel within Israel, transformed very substantially. Once again, Israel underwent that next oscillation of the seesaw from the sense of optimism following the Egyptian peace treaty to a sense of responsibility for this unfolding disaster in Lebanon, and a sense that it was perceived by the world no longer as a beleaguered victim, but in fact as the bully of the neighborhood. That's when we can begin to see this sensibility really take root.
From our experience at the time, we were horrified, but it was sort of say, okay, this is what happens when you encounter the Israeli military. What was new about it was exactly the things that you're saying, that we saw that Israelis were upset. We didn't quite understand why they were upset this time, but they were upset. I know there are good reasons, I know now, but remember, I'm a kid. And we certainly knew that the world had a different reaction. So those were powerful things. We understood there are Israelis who don't like this kind of thing, who knew, and that the world maybe is getting a different sense, maybe understanding some of the ways we experience things for the first time.
And this is a moment, I should add, not only were there significant demonstrations in Israel, but American Jews for the first time were expressing concern or even opposition to decisions taken by Israeli political leaders. If any of you read, as my father recommended I do today, Ronald Lauder's op-ed in today's New York Times, you will see that there's a kind of tradition of loyal opposition that really began to a certain extent in 1982.
Also, the Israeli inquiry into this, the Kahn Commission, which is still not fully released, but it was an impressive thing in the Arab world, because this has traditionally not been thinkable in the Arab world for
just as in the wake
to investigate its own atrocities. That just doesn't happen.
As in the wake of the intelligence failure of '73 that prompted the Agranov Commission, so too Sabra and Shatila prompted a great deal of moral introspection in Israel, and the creation of a commission of inquiry known as the Kahn Commission that actually issued a recommendation that Ariel Sharon should step down as Minister of Defense, which he did, although he remained a minister without portfolio in the government.
The juiciest parts are still not published, but it was, even for those Arabs who thought it was basically a whitewash or an understating of everything, it was really an impressive thing. Very, very impressive.
First Intifada? You want to pick up on the First Intifada?
Sure. Now, with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict shifting inward, after the '82 war, the PLO was driven into exile in Tunis, not in Lebanon right next door. It was not operating from anywhere adjacent to historical Palestine. It was driven to Tunis, and it was sinking into irrelevancy. At the same time, a new generation of people in the occupied territories was sort of coming up to kind of claim agency. And they started a kind of grassroots, almost Gramscian kind of set of protests that were then met with force by the Israeli occupation army, which is all any occupation army ever has. And the thing spiraled into the first uprising, which was largely done by, as you say, civil disobedience, boycotts, and stone throwing. It wasn't Gandhian nonviolence, but for the most part, until the last phases, the violence on the part of Palestinians was essentially symbolic violence, like this, throwing rocks at tanks and things. It has a very different dynamic. On the others, it doesn't produce the moral impact of real nonviolence, but it gives you a sense of what it was. Now, what happened is first the image of Israel and the Palestinians in the international community gets really rejiggered. It's already a bit disrupted by 1982, but here you get really the sort of old narrative of David and Goliath here being inverted. It's, sort of the attention called to the occupation and the lives of ordinary people under occupation for the first time. It also reinvigorates the Palestinian national movement and ends up with the PLO coming back into the occupied territories because they were able, after a lot of maneuvering, to gain control of the movement away from local people. Abu Jihad, who was a very senior PLO leader, was the point person on this, and for his pains he was executed in his home in front of his family. I think Ehud Barak was in a plane overhead directing this particular assassination. Anyway, once he was gone, I think the thing sort of petered out a bit and lost its momentum. But not only was the PLO back and now operating in the occupied territories in a kind of new way, in an not external guerrilla warfare, not international terrorism, not piggybacking off of the Arab countries in any way, but on the ground. Resistance, whether violent or not violent, there they are. And also, in order to counter that, the Muslim Brotherhood created Hamas. With a great deal of cooperation and facilitation by the Israelis, who allowed these guys to do all kinds of things they would have been arrested for otherwise. But I think the idea was, well, let's let the Palestinians split themselves into secular and Islamist versions. That'll be great. I don't know how well they think it's worked out, but it certainly did happen. So if that was the idea, it worked well. But it did begin that split within the Palestinian movement of the Islamists versus the nationalists, and we're living with all of that now, right?
Right, so I just want to highlight 3 points based on what Hussein said. First, the Intifada represents the generational and political struggle within the Palestinian national movement and the transfer of power from the diaspora to the homeland, to the West Bank. Very significant development.
Yeah.
Second, Israel proved its aptitude in fighting conventional armies. It turns out to be a much more difficult proposition to fight against this range of tactics here, from civil disobedience to stone throwing. The most advanced weaponry won't help you much. It's a different strategy of engagement altogether. And in fact, this proved to be a very difficult battle to wage for Israel. One of the sort of infamous moments that emerged was the statement by Israeli Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin, then Defense Minister, that the tactic of the Israeli Defense Force should be simply to break the bones of stone throwers. That was the state of technology in dealing with an intifada or uprising. The question that emerges is, what was the effect of the intifada? What was the effect of this pendulous swing of power back to locals on the ground in the West Bank, and the relative inefficacy of the Israeli Defense Forces to figure out how to put an end to it. And we say that because
I've got
of
a
what
couple
follows.
of points before we go to that,
Yeah.
if you're ready.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I mean, you asked the right question, so I have two things I want to say about that. One is, it's solidified in the Palestinian narrative, combined for the first time, the practical work of national leaders and the so-called revolutionary movement, or whatever the national energies you want to put, with two things. First, with the people on the ground in the occupied territories, who until then were sort of either bystanders or they would leave and join the PLO or one of these other groups and become part of it outside. But it was actually being done in Palestine for the first time under the Israeli noses and in direct challenge of it. The other thing it linked to was a two-state solution, because it was very much people under occupation fighting not for some abstraction or to reverse something from 60 years ago or correct some historic wrong or something. It was about their daily lives now, their ability to leave their house and go to the next village and whatnot. It's very immediate, and it's about them there and now. And all these things get fused. The two-state solution, on-the-ground resistance, and the national movements have come together. The problem is, of course, there's this split that I mentioned between Islamists and secular nationalists that just got bigger and bigger. The other thing, and this is really significant, is you see this image kind of shows you what the new valorized heroic ideal for a young Palestinian is. It's going to demonstrate, maybe not throwing a rock at a tank, but it's activism on the ground. Between 47 and 87, the main thing young Palestinians did was study, because they really didn't have they didn't even have a society to look after them. All they had was their diplomas. And that gave rise to these two generations of Palestinians that were particularly well educated, particularly adept, particularly as individuals, not as a society. They had this reputation of being the most literate, the most cultured, the most well-educated of the Arabs, etc. And it's because they studied more than anyone else, because they didn't have anything other than their individual diplomas to put food on the table. Well, this shifts in 87, because the idea that the valorized ideal is no longer the best student. It's now the most ardent demonstrator. And schools closed down for most of the Second Intifada. So people weren't getting educated anyway. And then they were going out onto the streets. A very large number of young people started this parade of going through Israeli prisons. So prisons kind of replace universities in the Arab world as the incubators of the next generation of Palestinian leaders. It throws up very, very different people. And the fetishization of education among Palestinians has never been recovered and probably never will be recovered. And it changed very much the nature of that society.
Right, so we have to move on, but I have two more comments on this slide. So I want to modify or offer a somewhat different perspective about this process of really the recalibration of the picture of moral virtue here. Because from an Israeli perspective, the dominant image of the Palestinian, the inherited image, was of the keffiyeh-clad terrorist who undertook heinous acts of violence directed against civilians in the 1970s. This image is very different.
Yeah.
Okay. This is not a keffiyeh-clad terrorist attacking civilians. This is, it would seem, a civilian trying to take on the all-powerful Israel Defense Forces. And Israelis very much thought about their sons who were sent not into combat, but into this kind of military action, which is very different from the wars that Israel had fought previously. So even within Israel, there was an ongoing recalibration of that sense of moral virtue that led to all sorts of political developments that we'll talk about in just a minute. Another important point about that swing of the pendulum from Tunis and the home of the PLO headquarters to the local action from the bottom up in the West Bank. This, of course, made Yasser Arafat extremely nervous.
Yeah, of course.
It made him extremely nervous, and it made him inclined to regain the initiative, which in fact he did, or sought to do, in 1989, when in a series of interviews, he declared that the PLO charter calling for the destruction of the State of Israel was null and void. He used a French word caduc to convey it for reasons that are probably not clear to us, but very characteristic of Arafat's congenital ambivalence and ambiguity. Shortly thereafter, Israelis and Palestinians began to meet secretly, I should say in violation of laws that prohibited, on the Israeli side, Israelis from meeting Palestinians. A high-level but secret negotiations, which even the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, former Defense Minister, now Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, did not know of, began in the wake of this series of developments. So you can see this pendulum swing back and forth. The move from Tunis to the West Bank, then Arafat's desire to regain the initiative, Israelis recognizing yet another exercise in futility is underway. It's not possible to achieve peace through war alone, and it's not possible to defeat the Palestinian civilian population with massive military armament, which drives some on the left side of the political spectrum, the followers and close aides of an important figure in Israeli political history, Shimon Peres, particularly a deputy foreign minister by the name of Yossi Beilin, to commence back-channel talks in the wake of Arafat's declaration with Palestinians in the Norwegian capital of Oslo. That series of back-channel negotiations, which, by the way, follows the latest attempt by the United States to convene a peace conference in Madrid in 1991, makes dramatic progress over the course of 1992-93, and leads to yet another one of those stunning moments, at least in my own personal historical recollection, along with Sadat alighting from the plane, Bill Clinton nudging together two long-standing, hated rivals of one another, Yitzhak Rabin, now the Israeli Prime Minister, and Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, on the White House lawn as part of what came to be known as the Oslo peace process.
No, the crucial thing is this is the beginning of the peace process, which is now, it hasn't moved forward since the first Obama term, so there you go. But what it basically does is it sets up a couple of things that we're still living with. One is the letters of mutual recognition, which is the basis of the whole thing. A letter from Yasser Arafat, as the chairman of the PLO, to Prime Minister Rabin, saying the PLO recognizes Israel's right to exist in peace and security, free of threats of terrorism, etc. It's a full diplomatic recognition on behalf of the PLO. Rabin replied to Arafat as the Prime Minister of Israel, recognizing that, in effect, recognizing the PLO as the representative of the Palestinians and undertaking to enter into negotiations with it. If you believe in a two-state solution, this set up a rather lopsided equation, because on one side you have recognition, on the other side a pledge to negotiate, which is not really the same thing, but it was essential to get the ball going. The actual agreement that they came to included a couple of things. First, it set out the 5 final status issues, in effect, one of which is now apparently off the table, to listen to President Trump. He says he's taking Jerusalem off the table. He also won't commit to a two-state outcome, so I really don't know what talks he's talking about anymore. If there ever are any, we'd certainly have to clarify what is this thing we're talking about. Maybe the weather. I really don't know. The other thing it's set up is the reality on the ground, right? So that it takes the occupied territories and divided it into 3 sections. Area A, which is Palestinian local rule. Oh, thank you. Palestinian local rule. Area B, which is, and by the way, that includes most of the population centers of Palestinians. Area B, where Palestinians have some administrative zoning and planning rights, so very limited, but there they are, and no security responsibilities. And Area C, which is by far the bulk of the occupied territories, which remains entirely under Israeli control in every way. The idea was that Israel would withdraw. The Area A, B, and C thing is the initial phase. And according to the agreement, as I read it, and it seems there black letter, I don't see how you read it any other way, but Israel would withdraw from the rest of the occupied territories in phases over the next 5 years, that is, say, by 1998, except for Jerusalem, military areas, and settlements. Now, those are not defined, so that could be very huge amounts of territory, of course, but that was the idea. In fact, there were only a couple of minor adjustments to the original boundaries of Area A, B, and C, and in fact, that's what we have now, not 5 or 10 or 15, but a very long time later than that. And so it's very important to note that this thing was supposed to have expired some while back. I think the sell-by date was a long time ago.
So these were the thoughts that the Palestinians had uppermost in mind. What was the real promise of the Oslo process that first reached its first point of culmination in 1993 on the White House lawn? It was the promise of a state of their own and self-determination,
Right.
even though there was not an explicit recognition of such by Prime Minister Rabin. On the Israeli side, once again, in that seesaw of sentiments, this was a moment in which the prospect of an end to the century-long conflict between Jews and Arabs seemed to be imminent, right? But of course, God lies in the details. That sense of elation on the Israeli side was fostered by a peace treaty that Israel signed with Jordan in 1994 in the wake of the Oslo peace process, and the subsequent opening of diplomatic relations, secretly or otherwise, with many countries in the Arab world. So this was a real moment of opening that Oslo augured. Although Rabin never publicly affirmed his commitment to a Palestinian state, his close aide Eitan Haber says he very much had it in mind, and even there's a written document that suggests such. But nonetheless, this was the last card that Rabin wanted to hold on to. And I just have to say a word about Rabin, who was a gruff, Sabra, Israeli-born, Israeli military man throughout his entire life. The man, the author of the statement that Israeli soldiers should break the bones of Palestinian stone throwers, who became, in the 2 years between 1993 and 1995, the most eloquent spokesperson for peace that Israel perhaps has ever seen.
Yeah.
A remarkable transformation, a remarkable rhetorical transformation.
Well, he began his career overseeing the ethnic cleansing, there's no other word for it, of about 100,000 Palestinians from the Lida Ramle area where Lod is, the airport. He was the commander in charge of that. It's quite a transformation.
As Rabin assumed full stage and really became the representative of this new, confident Israel that was prepared to take a risk for peace. Largely unbeknownst to him, there was simmering beneath the surface a boiling cauldron of rage from the largely religious Zionist settler movement, that same movement that had been driven to a state of intoxicated glory by the Messianic victory in 1967. Which regarded Rabin as nothing less than a traitor, and indeed depicted him in posters and at rallies as the equivalent of Adolf Hitler. It was that culture of incitement that allowed a cell to take rise within Israel between 93 and 95 that ultimately succeeded in its task, which was the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, delivering a soaring message of peace, singing what is known as Shir HaShalom, the Song of Peace, as his last words uttered before descending from the platform and being shot to death on November 4th, and then he expired on November 5th, 1995. The assassination of Rabin was a shock to the Israeli system. His partner and longtime rival, Shimon Peres, foreign minister, took over as prime minister and was widely expected to win a sweeping victory in the new elections that were called. He faced a younger political figure from the right of the spectrum by the name of Benjamin Netanyahu. And in the run-up to the elections, much of that same culture of incitement that led to Rabin's assassination continued. And in a rather stunning victory, Netanyahu became the new Israeli prime minister in 1996. It should be noted, and it's important to just understanding how the two sides, and I'm talking about the Israelis and Palestinians, though I could just as easily be talking about the two Israeli sides, perceived it. There still was, on the part of a majority of Israelis, a sense of forward movement through the Oslo peace process. It's important to note that settlement growth continued and indeed escalated between 1993 and 1998, lending the impression to the Palestinian side that this process had delivered very little in terms of material change.
When I was doing my Ph.D. when this thing was signed, and I was interviewed by the local NPR station because I was writing about these things, and I said this peace treaty is probably not going to work because it does not contain any restriction on Israel's ability to build new or expand settlements. I mean, that was obviously the biggest problem from the beginning, and it remained such. And the settlement issue between Obama and Olmert, I guess it was. No, between Obama and Netanyahu was the last gasp of the peace process back in.
Right. So interestingly, there were two subsequent agreements that followed up on the initial Oslo. One was Oslo II, 1995.
And why?
The second was the Wye River Accord, Wye River, Maryland, at which Benjamin Netanyahu, then the prime minister, actually agreed to a number of...
Those are the adjustments I mentioned before. They're small adjustments, important, but small. Actually, also, Wye is worth mentioning because it was the one time that, or the last time, a Palestinian leader took a hit for the United States. Arafat took less than he wanted, he thought he could get, etc., because he was trying to show the United States that he could be a partner, and it actually worked out very well for him. That they've forgotten that lesson.
So we now come to
good idea.
The last Camp David summit of significance. That convened by President Bill Clinton in 2000, the summer of 2000, where he invited the two main protagonists on the Israeli and Palestinian side to attempt to bring final closure to the process that had commenced in the early 1990s and that he presided over in 1993 on the White House lawn. He was tremendously invested as a legacy of his work as president to bring closure to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, and summoned then Israeli Prime Minister as of 1999, Ehud Barak, a storied general, and Yasser Arafat to Camp David. Accounts vary about what happened at Camp David. In all likelihood, at least according to my account, I don't know if we've actually had this conversation, Arafat ultimately couldn't accept the Clinton parameters, the worked out details of a peace agreement that entailed the surrender of anywhere between 90 and 95% of the West Bank.
Oh, but the Clinton parameters were not published until after Camp David.
Right.
So that's a good critique for the next phase. At Camp David, there's no agreement on the part of the people, even just the Americans who were there, about what was offered and what wasn't offered. And I would just caution everybody, there is no document. There is no map, there is no memo, there is no list, there is no document that clarifies
there
that.
Are lots of drawings on pieces of paper by the two sides.
On the back of a napkin,
I would say, my sense is Arafat knew reasonably well what was being offered.
Yeah, I think so too.
Relatively little I mean, the fact of the matter is this is an important point to make. This is a situation in which we have two combatants, two warring sides, seemingly intractably divided, though we pretty much know the details of the peace agreement to the T territorially.
Yeah.
And they are the details laid out in the Clinton parameters.
That's right.
And my sense is people had a good sense at Camp David what was on the table. And Arafat faced a very difficult choice. The Oslo process was enormously unpopular on the Palestinian side. It would require a heroic sacrifice on his part. And at the end of the day, my sense is he couldn't agree.
Okay, so I look at it a little bit differently in the sense that I think they knew what minimally should be on the table, but it wasn't put on the table at Camp David. It was then brought out afterwards. And my friend Aaron Miller and others say if we had only put it on the table, then maybe we could have done something different. I don't disagree with the idea that Arafat was maybe never the guy who was not going to do this deal with the Israelis. I'm not sure, but I think it's a plausible reading of things. But what is true is that the conversation continued, the discussions got better. They continued into late December, early January of the next year at Taba, and they kept getting closer and closer. And then the conversation ceased for various reasons. So that the two things that I think are sort of demonstrably wrong with common narratives is, number one, that there was an offer made at Camp David that was rejected. I mean, there were several, and they were all rejected, but the conversation continued, so that just doesn't mean much. So, the second thing, and I really want to challenge this, is the idea that the Israeli side always makes offers, however good you think they are or not, and the Palestinian side rejects them. In fact, both sides have made countless offers to the other side, and neither has accepted a final deal from the other. There's no monopoly on making outrageous claims, and there's no monopoly on saying, oh, hell no.
Right. So we could go back and forth on this about who said what, and Barak claims he offered 95% of the West Bank explicitly at Camp David. One thing that I heard from a senior American negotiator who tried to understand and explain the psychodynamics of the room at Camp David where he was present was Barak couldn't look Arafat in the eyes. He would not look him in the eyes at no point. In other words, that sense of revulsion born by Arafat's image as a terrorist remained so deeply embedded in Barak that he couldn't look him in the eyes. And as this diplomat was implying, you cannot have a successful negotiation unless you look your other in the eye. So in any event, it is the case that until Clinton's last day in office, he sought to bring closure to the deal. As Hussein mentioned, at Taba, in Sinai, there were negotiations into mid-January 2001. Right. And far-reaching agreement was reached even on, it is said, partial Israeli acknowledgement of responsibility for the Nakba, for expulsions from in the 1948 war, as well as some agreement, it is said, on the refugee question. Whether or not that's true, we don't.
I'm sure it is true. I've heard it from both sides so many times. That the progress they made on the refugee issues was amazing.
Anyway, so in the wake of the collapse of the more public component of this process, namely the Camp David summit in the summer of 2000, a second intifada broke out in September 2001. Who's responsible for it? We don't have time to address now. But nonetheless, it is important to note that this inaugurated a new and far more violent conflict between Israel and the Palestinians than the first intifada. New mechanisms of terror and destruction by both sides. Suicide bombings on the part of Palestinians directed at Israeli citizens, kind of return to the tactics of the 1970s, it would seem, with the added element of Islamist terror tactics, an extremely heavy-handed response by the Israelis to this violence.
This is low-intensity warfare, which the first intifada was not. And it was pretty devastating to Palestinians. It's if you want to know about how the thing broke out, there's a very good document called the Mitchell Commission report, which I think gets as close to accurate as you could like. So I recommend that. David's absolutely right. The difference between the first and second Intifada is night and day. Not only was it low-intensity warfare, after a few months, the armed Palestinian groups early in February, it's really started using suicide bomb attacks against Israeli civilian targets. It was mainly driven by Hamas, but just as with religious rhetoric, so too also with these forms of terrorism. The PLO, extreme wings of the PLO, moved quickly not to be outbid by Hamas, so that it was Arafat who called this the Al-Aqsa Intifada, because it began at the mosque in Jerusalem, or the Palestinian narrative, which the Mitchell Commission sort of debunks quite nicely, is that this all happened because Sharon went to that mosque and people got mad and whatnot. Well, that was a factor, but it's not. The commission basically debunks both standard narratives quite nicely. So he was using that kind of religious terminology for the first time in his career, because of pressure from Hamas. And similarly, I think the use of suicide bombing was both sides, the Islamists and the nationalists, trying not to be outbid by each other in nationalism, in extremism, even in some kind of not religious ideology, but religious symbolism, religious, invoking those things. So it really solidified the rivalry and the split. Hamas rises in the course of this conflict for the first time, becoming a viable rival to the PLO for national leadership among the Palestinians. And that contest continues to this day, to the incredible detriment of Palestinian society. I mean, you're going to have a religious right. You're going to have these kind of, people who are zealots. But the difference is, because of the Second Intifada and everything that has followed, the religious zealots among Palestinians are viable contenders for national leadership, which is a calamity.
So we have taken a fair bit of your time, and I regret to say we have about 10 more minutes. So just hold to your, stay tight in your seats. We only have to cover 13 more years.
Let's come
I just want to say one thing about if. So what did you say?
I said, let's come back and do the future in another session.
Okay. I just want to say one very important thing about the Second Intifada. It featured the rise of Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement, as a very significant force. The effect in Israel was quite dramatic. Once again, Israelis tend to be dramatic, and I've said that on several occasions, and indeed the effect of the Second Intifada was dramatic. It led many Israelis who once had invested hope in the Oslo peace process to believe there no longer was any hope in a peaceful solution with the Palestinians. It led many Israelis to articulate quite explicitly, we now understand the true intent of our enemies. Right. It is jihadi, extremist terror. That is their intent. And there was a kind of disavowal of that earlier period of optimism that marks the 1990s. Yeah. But in ways that altered Israeli political opinions quite dramatically. Right. I should add that one very important demographic factor was the arrival in Israel of hundreds of thousands of Russians, most of whom were Jews, not all of whom, but most of whom were Jews, in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the former Soviet Union. Many of whom came with very rightist orientation, with a very rightist orientation in their political sensibility. Right. So you have the aftermath of the Second Intifada, the growing consolidation of a new right-wing sensibility owing to the Russians and a number of other political factors. And yet, I think the important question to ask, as we asked after the First Intifada, what impact did it have? Yeah. Because ironically enough, we see that in the wake of the Second Intifada, after Israel constructed a security wall or fence that oftentimes divided one neighborhood of a Palestinian town from the neighborhood across the street in ways that would seem to be intentional. The newly elected Israeli prime minister, quite remarkably, in the world of, in the tradition of, look who's made his way back, Ariel Sharon, discredited in the wake of the Lebanon war, now becomes prime minister of Israel. And the lesson that Sharon learns in the wake of the Second Intifada is not that Israel should recommence negotiations with its Arab neighbors, or for that matter, engage with the Palestinians, but rather undertake a unilateral withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, the densely populated southwestern strip on the Mediterranean coast that was the home to Islamic political movements like Hamas. And in 2005, remarkably, Sharon, also a figure on the right end of the spectrum, commences the withdrawal of all Jewish settlers, who numbered about 7,500, from the Gaza Strip. Interesting to ask how this relates to the Second Intifada and whether that kind of violence precipitated or prompted this action. Sharon's articulated rationale for the disengagement was in order to preserve the demographic balance in Israel. If Israel remained a dominant presence in the Gaza Strip with 1.5 million Palestinian Arabs, if it exerted control over that, it would face imminently a problem in maintaining a Jewish demographic majority. So that was Sharon's rationale for disengaging from Gaza. He had no partner. It was unilateral. He left a vacuum of power into which Hamas seized power and has been the dominant force in Gaza ever since.
So if I can just add something, the radicalization of Israeli society because of the experience of the Second Intifada was mirrored precisely on the Palestinian side. It was a very, very similar experience. Again, this reading or misreading of the other side as exterminationist in its fundamental attitude. And not only did it galvanize the rise, really drive the rise of Hamas from a fringe to a potentially mainstream and possibly even leadership position, there certainly are those who will not join the religious right no matter what. There are the Christians, there are leftists and Marxists, there are people who are neither of those, but they just aren't interested in the politics of headscarves and praying, and they want their whiskey and they just won't do that. So these people, especially in the diaspora, but also in Palestine, picked up the baton of the one-state movement. And they are also the core of the BDS campaign, internationally and in the occupied territories. So you have the rise of a robust religious right, but you also have this leftist center phenomenon as well. In both cases, it's a rejection of the two-state solution. In both cases, it proceeds with the idea that the Israelis are basically exterminationist or at least totally exclusionary in their attitude towards us.
Right. So what we just have lived through together is the rise of the golden age of the two-state era, the Oslo process.
The rise and fall.
And in 2005, we seem to see the beginning of the end of the two-state era. It's important to note that there are at least 4 quarters that support this new, old one-state idea. As Hussein just said, the religious right on the Palestinian side, the secular left on the Palestinian side.
Absolutely.
And in Israel, the right, far right, who say there should be a single Jewish state from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, and the far left, which believes that there should be a single democratic non-Jewish state. So you have this fascinating mirror image. Right and left together join forces on both sides.
Absolutely.
Okay. Here we have, I think we'll just briefly mention, another tantalizing moment after we've just declared the beginning of the end of the two-state era, in which, once again, it seemed as if the two sides had reached apparent agreement. And once again, as Hussein will remind us, there was actually no document in the
right.
room when Olmert and Abbas, according to some accounts, seemed to agree on making their way to a final resolution.
Yeah.
There were drawings on a paper napkin of a map, very famously. But at least according to Olmert's account, he offered the most far-reaching proposal to a Palestinian leader ever. And Abbas says, and the Palestinian side, Hussein?
Well, they denied that. They said no. What they said is, great, can we take notes? Can we take it with us?
Can we take a document out of the room?
Absolutely not. So then, then it just died. I mean, I think the main thing to take away from this is two things. Number one, you get these people in a room, if they're serious about it, they can come awfully close, if they need to, which means they could get the whole way if they were given the chance. The second thing is, it didn't happen again.
All right.
That's the bottom line.
Finally, we make our way to what I would call the Netanyahu era.
Yeah.
The nearly decade-long rule of Benjamin Netanyahu, the longest-serving Israeli prime minister, except for David Ben-Gurion, and he will perhaps surpass him. We'll see how that goes. Who, in the wake of the creation of that power vacuum in Gaza and Hamas's rise, oversaw a number of wars with Gaza, especially in 2012-14, that left a deep mark on a deep trace of bitterness, actually, on both sides, as Hamas sent rockets into Israel in large numbers, and Israel responded with overwhelming force. Throughout that period, we have still in power the Palestinian successor to Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, known as Abu Mazen, in whom there is, I think it's safe to say, without any exaggeration, declining confidence and rising corruption. During this decade of relative stasis on the diplomatic front, we see the further consolidation of the right in Israel, and some of you may have seen in yesterday's New York Times that in the midst of the swirling corruption investigations around Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, support for him in his traditional strongholds rises, which is an interesting reflection on Israeli political culture today. Will the investigations, the 4 investigations into Netanyahu that I'd be happy to elaborate later, mark the end of his reign, his near total domination over Israeli political life? That remains to be seen. And this suggests the first of our conclusions for now, which is that we seem to be on the brink of a new era, which will bring with it significant new challenges, especially on the diplomatic front, because there's no clear successor to Netanyahu and no one who has clearly stated that a resumption of negotiations is a top priority. But there are opportunities to open up, to crack open the political system, which has really been dominated by Netanyahu's absolute and masterful control over the political realm as well as the media. On the Palestinian side,
well, on the Palestinian side, we have stasis, right? We have this division that has existed after in 2006, the Palestinian, 2005-2006, Palestinians had back-to-back elections in which Mahmoud Abbas won 63% of the vote for president, so he was pretty clearly the president, and they have not had another election since. And the next year, Hamas won about 42% of the vote for parliament, which gave them a parliamentary majority. For a little less than a year, they tried cohabitation with an Islamist parliament and a nationalist president, and it absolutely didn't work, and they came to blows. Hamas physically expelled the PLO and Fatah from Gaza, and now you've had these two kind of encampments, the PLO ruling in the West Bank, Hamas ruling in Gaza, surrounded by not just Israel, but also Egypt, and really a growing kind of humanitarian crisis in that misruled and besieged and beleaguered territory. In both cases, they have not had elections. since 2006. So the parliament's term was up a long time ago. The president's term was up a long time ago. But the whole arrangement was supposed to expire in '98. So this is just beyond stale. And Palestinians, I think it's fair to say, have just kind of given up on, insofar as they are dynamic, they've gone back to the personal. They've gone very much back to what I can do now. I think what's significant that's changed is not within the Palestinian community, nor between Israel and the Palestinians. What's changed is the regional dynamic. And this is rather complicated, so I'd be happy to explain it in more detail a little later. But suffice it to say, the attitude towards Israel in the Arab world, in key parts of the Arab world, particularly in the Gulf, is changing, and it's changing fast. And it's changing partly because a new generation is coming up that looks at Israel as just another reality, and they don't have the same sense of taboo that their elders did. But more than that, there's a sense that Israel is not really a problem in the Middle East. Yeah, the occupation is the problem, but the real problem in the Middle East is Iran. This is a point of view shared by the Israelis. And in fact, after the fall of Aleppo in Syria, now the Israelis have kind of moved on a little bit much closer to the Arab point of view, because before the Syrian war started ending, the Israeli focus on Iran was very firmly on the nuclear question and to a little bit on Hezbollah in Lebanon. But the regional activities of Iran were kind of secondary. And it was absolutely the other way around for Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the others in the Gulf, where they said, okay, the nuclear file is bad. Iran's nuclear program, we don't like it, but the real problem is Iran's regional behavior. Now, as Iran and Hezbollah and Assad and Russia emerges victorious in Syria, I think the Israeli point of view is becoming much closer to the Gulf Arab point of view, which is no, actually the here and now in Iran's activities in the region are urgent. If not as urgent as the nuclear file, then it's certainly close. So you have this convergence of interests. And we have all kinds of little ways in which the parties are coming closer together. If you want me to go into it, I will. You have to ask me. There's a big problem, which is the political. There are three reasons why the Arab states can't go further with the Israelis until there's some progress on the Palestinians. Number one, politically they can't do it with their own public. Number two, they do have values. These are not the only value-free people in the world. They actually do believe in things, and this is something they believe in. And thirdly, they know that this occupation is a destabilizing factor, that every terrorist group, and Al-Qaeda, and ISIS, and Hezbollah, and Iran all exploit this. And you don't have to do anything about it, you just shout and outbid everybody. They know they'll never have a proper night's sleep in the way they want in the Middle East until the occupation is resolved, because it's too destabilizing. So for those three reasons, it is imperative for them to go forward, but they can't. They cannot do it until there's progress with the Palestinians.
Right. So,
reasons I say.
You know, one of the characteristic features of the two sides in the conflict is that they suffer from delusions of grandeur.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid to say that Hussein and I also suffer from some delusions, including the idea that we can one day condense a lecture to 45 minutes.
Yeah.
We've taken 90 minutes of your time. Thank you very much for your attention.
I want to say thank you to this very interesting conversation. But I will say that I think it should go on, not today, but next time. There's a lot more to talk about in the present and maybe even the future.
Yeah.
So next time.
We're getting close.
But thank you.
Okay, so no
Thank
question.
you.
No question. Yeah.
I think.
Okay.